Up until that day, my life felt stable, grounded in a routine built over years of dedication and commitment. I had a solid job, a family I deeply valued, and a quiet sense of pride from the hard work I'd put into building a life I thought would never fall apart. Everything felt secure, my days centered around my wife, Marcy, and our 2 sons, the world I woke up to each morning. Looking back, though, maybe that stability made me naive, convincing me that what I relied on could never change. But life, I learned, has a way of delivering shocks that can upend even the most certain expectations. This realization didn't creep up on me gradually. It struck in a single, unforgettable moment, reshaping my world instantly. It sounds like an old story, but it really happened. I wish I could tell it in some elegant or dramatic way, but there's no dressing it up. Discovering my wife's affair felt like a worn-out cliché coming true. As for my job, I work in an auto parts plant, handling brakes, a necessary if thankless task. And yes, fate played its hand that night. From 4 to midnight each day, 5 days a week, I operate one of the oldest machines you've ever seen. I wear safety goggles, earplugs, steel-toed boots, and a denim apron. I hit my quota daily and, if I'm lucky, earn a year-end bonus. I have a modest, comfortable house with 3 bedrooms, a lovely wife, and 2 sons in elementary school. After 12 years of marriage, everything seemed fine. Until today. We have 5 stations where we assemble brake pads, all running on compressed air. For 8 years, we've had no issues with the equipment. Today, halfway through the shift, the compressed air system failed. The air powering the machines needs to be perfectly dry, filtered, and dehumidified by equipment that almost never fails. Almost. Tonight, the dehumidifier couldn't release the moisture it collected. I'm no expert, but I know that moisture and high-pressure air together cause freezing, and everything stops. Instead of waiting around, they sent the whole team home, without pay, of course. You could say my life unraveled because of that trapped moisture. When I opened our bedroom door, I saw a large, hairy back moving up and down on my wife. Marcy, of course. I instinctively turned on the light, and Marcy was wide awake. "Damn it, Danny, what are you doing here?" she snapped. I thought she'd be afraid, remorseful, embarrassed. But all I got was anger. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. "Oh, don't act like an idiot. You know exactly what's going on," she retorted. "I'm sorry you had to see this, but if you'd come home on time, this wouldn't have happened." The guy looked back at me and smirked. Marcy pulled up the blanket, trying to cover herself. My big mistake was grabbing this guy when he got out of bed. He was a lot bigger standing than lying down. My reward was 2 very hard punches to the ribs. I didn't manage to land a strike and ended up on the floor, struggling for air. I think it was around then I took a punch to the head that sent me over the edge. Later, in the ER, a technician was bandaging my ribs while Marcy sat nearby, looking disgusted. After the tech left, I turned to her. "Marcy, who the hell is this guy, and what was he doing in our house?" I demanded. "His name's Tony," she replied calmly. "He's my friend, and I invited him over." "You slept with him? In our bed? With our kids just down the hall?" "Yes," she said, unfazed. "And if you hadn't made such a scene, they'd still be asleep. I had to call my sister to watch them just to bring you here." "What was he doing there?" I pressed. She rolled her eyes. "How many times are you going to ask that? We had sex. We fooled around. Is that really so hard to understand?" "Is this a regular thing or a one-time deal?" I asked, barely holding it together. She hesitated, then admitted, "Tony and I have been together for about 6 months. We tried to keep it from you. We usually don't come to the house, but I couldn't find a babysitter." I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Is it over now?" "No, Danny," she said bluntly. "This isn't ending. You're a good dad and husband, but Tony's great in bed. There's no reason to stop just because you know now. We just won't meet at the house again. It's unfair to you and the kids." I stared at her, stunned. "Marcy, this is unacceptable. We're done. If you try to break this off, you'll regret it," she warned. "Tony knock you without breaking a sweat, and he'll do it again. If you act up, everyone will know your wife's with another man, and you're too weak to stop it. Friends and neighbors will know first. I'll make sure your family knows what a loser you are. Your coworkers will call you a betrayed man. Think it over, Danny. Even your sons might hate you. Do you really want that? Do you want to look like a fool just to humiliate me? I'll make sure that happens. Tony thinks you're a wimp. So do I. You'll have to learn to live with it, Danny." "Who is this guy?" I demanded, barely containing my anger. "Where does he work?" "He doesn't work, Danny," Marcy replied with a hint of condescension. "He owns Continental Classics, the luxury car dealership on Lancaster Pike. You know, The one you always wanted to check out but never got around to. He's richer, smarter, and better in bed than you. And apparently, he's stronger too. Why don't you just marry him if he's so perfect? I shot back. She smiled coolly. That's why I keep you around, honey. Tony doesn't like kids, and I'm not giving mine up for him. So you get to play dad, and Tony gets the romance. And I'm just supposed to go along with this? I asked, incredulous. Her expression hardened. You don't have a choice. You can accept it, or everyone will know what a pathetic loser you are. By the way, I'm moving your things to the guest room. Now that the secret's out, there's no reason for us to share a bed. As she got up to leave, part of me felt relieved, but curiosity nagged at me, so I asked, So, who watched the kids while you were out with Tony? Karen usually did, she replied casually. Sometimes I drop them off at your parents'. And by the way, it was Karen who introduced me to Tony. I made a mental note to thank Karen as Marcy left the room. I was discharged the next morning, but Marcy wasn't there. At that point, I had a choice. Call someone for a ride or take a taxi. I chose the taxi. The kids were in school, and Marcy was out. I found my clothes and personal things stacked on the guest bed. I figured Todd and Terry would have questions about all this, so I decided to let Marcy explain it to them. It took me less than an hour to settle into my new space, though my mind was racing. There was no way I'd let this end the way Marcy planned. My first move was to head to the basement and dig out my old phone recorder. It only worked with a landline, but I didn't have any other options. Marcy usually called on her cell, but it only took 20 minutes to set it up and hide it behind some paint cans. Step 1 was done. I felt lousy, but I was ready to get back to work. I took some Tylenol instead of the stronger painkillers they gave me, since I didn't want to operate the machine while medicated. Marcy had seriously misjudged the level of support I had from the guys at work. I told them everything that went down last night, and they all pitched in with ideas, some useful, some ridiculous. It felt good to know they had my back. We started our 8-hour shift, each of us brainstorming ways to set things right. By our dinner break, we were deep into planning. All right, anyone got a solid idea? Glenn kicked things off. Not really, but I do have a cousin who works for that idiot, he said. He does detailing on the cars. From what he's told me, he hates DeMarco. He could probably give us the inside scoop on the place, like business details, layout, or shifts. That'll help, Glenn. Anyone else? I looked around. Danny jumped in. I have 2 rifles and 2 pistols. I could lend you one of each. They're all unregistered, so nothing to worry about. Thanks, Danny, but that's a bit more drastic than I'm aiming for, I replied. Well then, you probably won't want to hear my idea, Freddie said with a chuckle. Go on, Freddie, spill it. Freddie leaned forward, grinning. I say we tie him to a tree, legs spread, and light a fire Indian style right between his legs. Everyone got a kick out of Freddie's wild idea, but we obviously had to rule it out. Kyle, who had been quiet so far, suddenly had all eyes on him. What? Stop staring at me like that, he protested. You got any ideas? I asked him. Yeah, but it's kind of weird. Let's hear it, Kyle. Kyle shifted uncomfortably. I read about a prison in Arizona where they made PDF files wear pink jumpsuits. Must have been humiliating. I know Tony's not a PDF file, but something like that could embarrass the hell out of him. You mean dress him in a pink tracksuit? Couldn't he just take it off? I thought if we sprayed him down with pink paint, it'd really make a statement. Then he'd know who did it, I pointed out. We'd have to knock him out first and leave him tied up until someone found him. How do we do that? With pills or knock him out cold? Kyle shrugged. I could get a taser. Just sneak up and zap him. Easier said than done. How do we get close enough without him noticing? I don't know, but it's an idea, Kyle said with a sigh. The buzzer sounded, signaling the end of our break. We had 4 more hours left in the shift, and since my quota was low, the guys helped cover for me. When I got home, Marcy was already asleep. At least she'd kept her word about not bringing that clown into our house. But I still didn't have a real plan. Most of the guys' suggestions felt like high school pranks. I might as well put a flaming bag of dog poop on his porch. I needed something serious. By the time I woke up, it was noon. The kids were at school, and I heard Marcy moving around the house. I quickly showered, shaved, and headed out. Good morning, husband. No kiss for your wife? She was standing at the kitchen sink, hand on her hip with a smirk. I turned and walked out without replying. Her sarcasm didn't deserve an answer. I needed breakfast and some alone time. The rest of the day was just a matter of passing the time, trying to figure out how to deal with my wife's lover without causing a scene. I needed to finish my shift tonight and start planning. I decided not to eat at home anymore, which was my only real time with the kids. But I couldn't stomach Marcy's cooking now. Soon it was time to head to work. Everything went smoothly until the dinner break, when Danny leaned over saying, "I've got a taser in my car. Not sure if you can use it for anything, but at least you'd have it for self-defense." Kyle grinned, seeming pleased with himself. "Don't forget to pick it up before you head home." "Have you ever even used that thing?" someone asked, and Kyle smirked. "We can test it out. Any volunteers?" The only response was a chorus of groans around the table. No one had new ideas, but everyone was on board to support whatever I decided. It was a comfort to know I had friends I could count on. When I got home, the house was quiet. It was going to be a short night for me. Working the night shift throws off your sleep schedule, especially on weekends, so I woke up earlier than usual. Todd and Terry were thrilled for a day at Chuck E. Cheese, and Marcy didn't seem to mind when I told her we'd be out all day. Then she dropped the news. "Danny, I need you to take a few days off next week. Tony's friend Wally is coming down from Detroit, and we're taking a 4-day cruise to Cancun." "If you can't swing it, maybe your parents could watch the kids?" I raised an eyebrow. "Let me get this straight. You're going on a cruise with 2 guys? Even for you, that sounds pretty outrageous." She shot back. "Don't be rude, Danny. It doesn't suit you. Wally's rooming with Karen. They've been friends for years." "Oh, in that case, I guess it's perfectly fine," I replied sarcastically, already planning to thank Karen later. I'd started the day a little too early to pass the time. We hit the hobby shop next to our house before Chuck E. Cheese opened. The boys were old enough to tackle most of the plastic model kits on display. Their finished work was nothing fancy, but they enjoyed it. I left them exploring the shelves and wandered around, bemused by the endless craft supplies for creative types. If Marcy had been into crafts, maybe she wouldn't have brought home that hairy ape, but it was too late now. My eyes lit up when I saw rows of designer spray paint, including 6 cans of pink. The selection wasn't as big as Lowe's or Home Depot, but it was pink, the only place I'd seen that color in a can. Taking it as a sign, I bought all 6 cans. Todd picked out a monster truck kit, and Terry went with a tow truck. I didn't even know they made tow truck models. Before we left, I grabbed a pack of 10 large plastic cable ties about 18 inches long that looked perfect for what I had in mind. By then, Chuck E. Cheese was open. The kids spent about 4 hours and 2 pizzas worth of energy before calling it quits. We stopped by Pandora Park with some cheap bread for the ducks, who devoured it in 10 minutes, but we stayed a couple more hours before heading to my parents for dinner. Todd and Terry spent the evening watching TV while I pulled Dad aside to explain Marcy's situation. I realized I was telling people before she had the chance, almost making her threats meaningless. Dad assured me they'd be there to support the kids no matter what happened, which made my plans easier. I didn't want the kids caught up in all this. Around 9 o'clock, I called Marcy to let her know we'd be staying at my parents' for the night. After breakfast at IHOP, we returned to find Marcy still in bed. I immediately turned on the lawnmower, making sure she'd hear it as I passed the bedrooms. Todd and Terry couldn't wait to start their model kits, and though it was a beautiful day, I let them go ahead. I spent the day on yard work, edging and trimming, but progress was slow because I kept stopping to chat with neighbors. I borrowed hedge trimmers from Mike Fielding across the street. His wife, Mary, was one of the neighborhood's biggest gossips, so I told Mike there might be strange cars around because Marcy would have her male friends over. I reassured him it'd be fine unless they got drunk and loud. In that case, he should call the police. I'd have a hard time controlling things since I work nights. Larry Finley, a church board member, lent me a spark plug wrench, and I apologized for Marcy's recent wild behavior. Naturally, he wanted details, and within 10 minutes, he had more than enough gossip to last him a month. I skipped lunch and wrapped up around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. After a quick shower, I treated myself to the most expensive meal at Rosie's Cantina. I'm not sure if it was worth the price, but it was delicious. I spent the rest of the evening with my brother Dave and his family, who were already up to speed on the situation thanks to Dad. I crashed on his couch for the night. Marcy thought she could control me by threatening to humiliate me as a betrayed man. If I didn't support her affair, she'd make my life miserable. It was a clever idea but flawed. In less than a week, I'd already told everyone. That move neutralized her threat, making her look more approachable to others than she'd planned. I doubt she ever expected me to react this way. The following day, I arrived home to change for work, only to find Marcy waiting for me, furious. "What did you tell the neighbors?" she demanded. Karen says you're going around telling people I run a brothel here at night. Come on, Marcy, I replied. That's not what I said. I just mentioned you might have male company when I'm working, so they shouldn't worry about it. Well, that's not how it sounded to them. Who else did you talk to? Everyone, I admitted. I figured it'd be easier to reach them before you did, but don't worry. I haven't mentioned anything to your parents or sisters. You might want to get to them before rumors do. Damn it, Danny. You're making me look like a cheater. Well, that's only fair, considering you were trying to make me look like a betrayed man. I glanced at my watch. Sorry, dear, but I need to get to work. The hardest part for me was missing the quality time with my kids. Glenn gave me the best news of the night. Continental Classics closed at 9 o'clock on Thursdays, so Tony could handle payroll alone without interruptions. Not even the cleaning staff would be there. Kyle showed me how to use the taser, though no one had yet volunteered to test it. The plan was ready. I fully expected to get caught, maybe even do some jail time, but it didn't matter. Tony DeMarco needed to be humiliated, and if I was arrested, I'd make sure every news outlet knew the full story. That kind of publicity would wreck him, or at least make him angry enough to mess up. For the next few days, I only went home to sleep, shower, and change. I never ate at home after that first day. Finally, Thursday arrived. I arranged for my truck to break down so Kyle could give me a ride. The floor supervisor didn't bother those of us who worked at a steady pace, as long as quotas were met and quality was good. With the gloves, aprons, and welding goggles we all wore, OSHA regulations ensured we looked identical on the line. At 8:30, I slipped out the back. The guys took turns running my machine to keep up appearances. Bathroom breaks were frequent and never monitored closely, so no one would think twice about my absence. I entered Continental Classics through the service door and went straight to the restroom. Just after 9 o'clock, I checked the lights, then put on latex gloves and slipped into the dimly lit office. Tony's desk faced the showroom with his back to the door. It seemed easier than I'd anticipated. A computer was in front of him, but he was focused on an old adding machine, pounding away on the paper tape. He didn't hear me approach. I shot Tony in the back of the head with the taser. His body idioted, and he almost turned around, so I shot him again. This time he twitched a few times and then went limp. Perfect. I secured his legs and arms with 2 plastic ties each, then used an old tie as a blindfold. He was surprisingly pliable. I wheeled his chair up to the glass partition by the showroom, where everyone would see him first thing in the morning. The pink paint looked great, though I had to use a lot more than expected. It soaked into his clothes quickly, so it took 3 coats in each spot to get the look I wanted. I barely had enough paint, but I finished it. He looked quite striking in pink. Once I was done, I packed up carefully. I'd expected him to wake up at some point, but he remained still. I'd planned to remove the blindfold before leaving. I glanced at my watch a few times, but he didn't stir. After 5 minutes, I started to worry. I tried to find his pulse, but couldn't feel it through the latex gloves. Removing a glove, I checked his pulse again, this time at his neck, like they do on TV. Nothing. I took off the blindfold and tapped his eye lightly with a pencil. No reflex. Panic started setting in. I quickly put my glove back on and wiped down everything I might have touched. I pocketed the tie and cut off all the plastic ties. The unpainted lines on his skin gave him a raccoon look. After a final scan to ensure I hadn't missed anything, I slipped out. On my way back, I tossed everything, including the taser, down a storm drain. 10 minutes later, I was back on the line, assembling brake pads, unnoticed. When the shift ended, I filled the guys in on what had happened. They'd all been complicit, so I was confident no one would speak up. Freddie was especially impressed, and none seemed fazed. Kyle drove me home, both of us taking mental note of the drop-off time. I didn't sleep long. Around 10 o'clock, Marcy stormed into my room, her face twisted with fury. "What have you done? What have you done, you little fool?" she spat, standing over me. I rolled over and looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about? Tony's dead," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Karen called and told me they found him in his office this morning. I know you had something to do with it, and I'll make sure you pay for this." That was the second time she'd called me a fool in less than 5 minutes. It was clear I wasn't going back to sleep, so I got out of bed and headed to the bathroom. Not in a hurry to face her wrath, I took a long, hot shower, shaved, and even splashed on aftershave, if only to irritate my loving wife a bit more. When I finally stepped out, I noticed a tall man in a dark suit with close-cropped hair standing in the living room, talking quietly with Marcy. She had definitely called the police. Shaking my head, I went into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee. Marcy's smug expression didn't escape me as I sat down in my usual chair, while the visitor took a seat across from me. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Detective Darnell Green," he said, his tone formal. "I'm here regarding the pass away of Anthony DeMarco last night. Your wife mentioned a recent disagreement between you two, and I'd like to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Detective," I replied, nodding. "I have no problem with that, but not here." The detective raised an eyebrow. "What do you propose?" "If we're going to talk, let's do it in your office, not my home. Is that agreeable?" I glanced at Marcy, who looked distinctly displeased. She'd clearly expected to be part of this discussion. "Your car or mine, Mr. Mercer?" "I have an errand to run first, so I'll meet you there. Which office?" "Second floor in the back, room 206. Take a right off the elevator. I'll see you soon." Marcy shot me a furious look as I slipped on my shoes. I left my coffee half finished, dumped it in the sink, and turned to her with a smile as I headed out the door. "Looks like you'll get what you wanted, dear," I said. "What are you talking about, Danny?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "What does that mean?" 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Detective Green in room 206 of the municipal building. For the next hour, he asked all the right questions and I had all the right answers. He was careful not to push too hard or make things personal, and I appreciated that. I admitted I had a motive, but explained that I'd never had an actual chance to act on it. It was a serious conversation, but I kept things friendly, without being smug. Detective Green seemed to appreciate my cooperation, and I felt like he had no further questions. The most surprising part was when he revealed that Tony had died from a heart condition. He'd had a pacemaker installed a few years back, which apparently hadn't reacted well to the taser. They'd identified the taser from marks on his neck. I was sorry about Tony's pass away, but a part of me was relieved. Detective Green gave me the standard "don't leave town" warning, mentioning that he'd confirm my alibi before speaking with me again. Honestly, I'd never thought I'd need an alibi for anything. It was oddly thrilling. We ended on good terms, and I felt like Darnell Green was on my side. The thought gave me a warm feeling. I grabbed some food and watched the news, where they reported the pass away of a local businessman, noting he had no known relatives. I emptied my bank accounts and took a leisurely breakfast. When I got home, Marcy was gone. It took me about half an hour to move all my things back into the master bedroom and transfer her belongings to the guest room. The small closet and chest of drawers were more than enough for her things, so I laid everything out on the bed for her to sort through. Checking the phone in the basement turned up nothing of interest. I gathered bank and insurance papers as well as other important documents, relieved that the Volvo Marcy drove was in my name. I stashed all the paperwork in a folder under the front seat of my truck, then called work to take 2 weeks off. A few hours later, Marcy came home, surprised to find me there. I smiled and led her to the guest room. "What's all this?" she demanded. "Who do you think you are?" I grinned widely. "Answer me, Danny, what's going on?" "Here's the deal, Marcy," I said calmly. "From now on, I'll be staying in the master bedroom and you'll be in the guest room. I suggest you start putting your clothes away. Anything not in the closet or dresser by dinner will be removed. Any questions?" "I can't fit my things in this little closet and I'm not staying here anyway," she snapped. "What do you mean by removed?" "If you can't fit it in the closet or dresser, you don't need it," I replied. "That's not happening, Danny," she said defiantly. "Whatever game you're playing won't work. You're dead meat." "I suggest you start organizing," I said, unfazed. "I'll be back later if you have more questions." "Fool," she muttered the third time that day. I had to be doing something right. With Marcy preoccupied, I went to the kitchen and emptied her purse, carefully picking out what I wanted. I took her phone, car keys, driver's license, and all credit and debit cards, leaving the rest. Grabbing the car papers from my truck, I drove her Volvo to a friend's used car lot across town. I sold it to him at a good price with the condition that he'd resell it outside the city. After paying off the remaining balance, I still had a few extra $1,000. I was just about to head to Taco Bell for lunch when my cell phone rang. "You fool!" she screamed. "What did you do with my cell phone? And where the hell is my car?" I was pleased she didn't call me a fool this time. She was calling from the home phone, which was a promising sign. I put on my most apologetic tone. "I'm so sorry, honey. I needed the cash to hire a lawyer to defend myself against liquidation charges. I promise I'll get you a new car as soon as I'm out of prison." When I hung up, still hearing her curse on the other end, I turned off my phone. After that conversation, I knew I needed a lawyer. Staying married was out of the question, but that would have to wait. I was next in line to order. Todd and Terry were home when I arrived. and I went straight to my son's room, ignoring Marcy except for a few glances. She didn't look pleased. The boys were eager to show off the models they'd built. As Marcy started on dinner, I wandered to the guest room, where my clothes were back on the bed, and hers had been moved to the master bedroom. I chuckled, but decided not to argue. She seemed set on her decisions. When Marcy called the boys to wash up, I went to gather my things from the guest room. Although I was tempted to toss out her belongings, that would be too petty. Instead, I made a reservation at Red Lobster. Money wasn't an issue. I had cash left even after putting down a retainer for the divorce lawyer. Dinner was good, especially the cheese buns. Just as I finished, my phone rang again. Hoping it was work or Detective Green, I was disappointed. It was my wife. "Danny," she said, annoyed. "How am I supposed to get to the store?" "We need milk and a few other things." "I'll take you when I get home," I replied, suggesting she plan trips for Saturdays when I don't work. "I'll feel better if you don't go alone." Before she could respond, I cut in, "They're calling me again. We'll talk later." I hung up. The second call was from Kyle. Detective Green interviewed everyone, individually and as a group. All the stories checked out. Tom Tingle, the floor manager, backed you strongly. Said there's no way you could have left. "Tom kept us all under close watch," I replied. "He'd vouch I was there all night." But I knew if anyone wanted to prove I'd liquidated Tony DeMarco, they could, though it seemed no one was trying. I got home just in time to tuck the boys in. Marcy sat on the couch with a glass of wine. I grabbed a cold Foster's from the fridge and took my seat. With the TV off, it seemed like a good time to talk. "So, Marcy," I started, "how's the plan to turn me into a joke going?" That ended things quickly. She drained her wine, stood up, and walked to her room. "I thought you wanted to talk," I called after her, but she disappeared. I took my beer and checked the answering machine. Her first call was to her sister Marge, who clearly knew about Marcy's affair with Tony and supported her completely. Good to know. The next was to her mom, who was clueless. Marcy painted Tony as a friend of Karen's and claimed I was jealous, saying Tony had scolded me for it, which made me angry. She didn't outright accuse me of eliminating him, but her mom seemed to pick up on that. Marcy also called the cell company, trying unsuccessfully to replace the phone I took. She reported her driver's license stolen to the DMV, who advised her to inform the police and requested a new credit card, only to find her account closed. Busy day, I thought. The last call was from Karen, who lived just a few houses down. They'd talked instead of meeting, which worked in my favor. I picked up two important details. Wally was still coming from Detroit, and Marcy planned to stay low until he arrived. The next morning, the guys and I left the house early, well before Marcy woke up. We got back after lunch, and Marcy insisted I take her to the grocery store since she didn't have a car or license. Later, as she prepared dinner, I checked the recorder. Wally had arrived and immediately called Marcy. They had an intense conversation. He believed everything she told him and wanted revenge for Tony. Wally and Tony were childhood friends, so he wasn't willing to let it go. He gave Marcy his address, asking her to call him the next day. Marcy excitedly shared the news with Karen, sounding like a different person from the woman I'd married. I couldn't believe how suddenly she'd changed. It was as if eliminating her lover had made me the enemy. That evening, I went out to grab something to eat, putting off dealing with Marcy. The lawn needed mowing again the next day, giving me an excuse to stay out of her way. Around 11, Marcy's parents arrived to take the boys for a sleepover, though I hadn't been told in advance. Grandma Wilcox assured me she'd have them at school on time, so I didn't object. I was eager to check my phone records, but decided to grab lunch first. After a quick shower, I went to see Dennis, while Marcy stayed silent about my not eating at home. It turned out Marcy and Wally had planned a way to avenge Tony's pass away. If I didn't already know their scheme, it would have seemed almost laughable. The plan was for Wally to sneak into the house through the unlocked sliding door, and they'd make it look like a robbery gone wrong, where I'd end up shot. Marcy and Karen were supposed to call emergency if they heard fire shot. It struck me then that I hadn't changed my life insurance beneficiaries. After sarcastically kissing Marcy goodbye and getting a rude gesture in return, I spent the evening at my parents' and borrowed my dad's short-barreled snake charmer rifle, perfect for what I had in mind. When I got home, Marcy was already in bed with her light on, apparently reading. Karen's voice was the only one on the answering machine, boasting to Marcy about her day with Wally. She promised Marcy everything would be ready that night. I spent about 20 minutes swapping out the rifle shells with rock salt instead of buckshot. I had a leftover bag from last winter. I didn't want to eliminate Wally, just stop him. I got comfortable in my chair with my cell phone nearby and waited. Just after midnight, I saw Wally on the deck. I dialed emergency, reporting an intruder, saying I feared for my life, and left the line open. Wally slid the patio door open and stepped inside. Once he was fully in, I fired, aiming low. The shot threw him back out onto the terrace. A second shot struck him, and he fell off, breaking the railing. His screams confirmed he was still alive, though the rock salt clearly hurt. The shots were deafening in the house, my ears ringing. I turned on the lights, and Marcy came running into the room, yelling incoherently. Ignoring her shouts, I checked on Wally. A .22 Ruger with a silencer lay nearby. Marcy kept screaming until I pointed the rifle her way, and she quickly bolted from the room. Wally had broken his ankle in the fall. Seems he got lucky. 10 minutes later, a police car pulled up. I placed my tool on the floor to avoid any misunderstandings. Pointing to the phone, I watched as one of the officers informed the emergency operator that things were under control. They asked who else was in the house, and I mentioned Marcy was in the bedroom. They brought her out, but she unleashed a stream of curses that none of us could quiet. Finally, a large female officer took Marcy's hand and led her outside. I spotted Karen with the other neighbors and gave her a sarcastic gesture. She quickly turned away, lifting my spirits. The ambulance arrived for Wally just as Detective Green showed up. We exchanged smiles, and I couldn't help but grin back. The big officer brought Marcy back inside to get dressed, and after she calmed down a bit, we headed to the police station. I insisted we take separate cars, and Detective Green let me ride with him. We didn't speak on the drive, but Green gave me a knowing look. After a short talk at the station, he released me around sunrise. They'd kept me up all night with endless coffee. A patrol car took me home, where I was surprised to see no crime scene tape. It was as if nothing had happened. The rock salt didn't even crack the glass door. I guessed Wally had taken the worst of it. Exhausted, I fell asleep and didn't wake until afternoon. Heading into the kitchen, I was surprised to find Detective Green already there, reading the paper and drinking a coffee he'd apparently made himself. I poured myself a glass of orange juice and sat across from him, still wondering how he'd gotten in. "You're a tough guy, Mr. Mercer," he remarked, his eyes still on the paper. I kept quiet, unsure if he was serious or joking. After a moment, I excused myself to shower, shave, and grab a bite to eat. "Take your time, Danny. I've got all day," he called after me. I made 2 hefty sandwiches with pork, and when I returned, Green joined me, silently sipping a beer. We ate in silence until he finally broke it. "Got questions, don't you, Mr. Mercer?" he asked, glancing at me. "I'd say the same about you," I replied. He signaled for the waiter and ordered another round of beers. "We've been questioning you all night. Now it's your turn," he said, leaning back. "Fine. First off, where's my wife?" "She's still in custody. She'll be arraigned this afternoon." That caught me off guard. Did her parents get her a lawyer? I was careful not to reveal too much, though his answer raised more questions. "Good to know her family's there for her, because I won't be. If there's anything else you'd like to share, go ahead," I said, gauging his reaction. He chuckled and took a long sip. "One more thing. Ever record your wife's chats with Mr. Williams?" "You mean Wally? If I had a tape like that, would you want it?" "It could help," he replied. "Though we'll see. With a strong enough lawyer, maybe." "And would having that tape backfire on me?" I asked, considering his angle. "You're smart to think of that. Just trying to make my job easier," he said with a slight smile. "I'll see what I can do without a tape," I replied, giving a small nod. Green set his glass down and looked me in the eye. "Danny, it's time to take you home. Your boys need their dad." We arrived just as the bus dropped off Todd and Terry. They were excited to meet my detective friend and asked to see his badge. Green played along, asking, "So who built the tugboat and who built the monster truck?" "I built the truck," Todd said proudly. "I made the tug. Want to see it?" Terry offered. "Maybe next time," Green said, smiling as he walked to his car. As he left, I realized he knew more than he let on, especially about the pink paint. He had me exactly where he wanted, and I was helpless to change it. That evening, we ordered pizza, and the boys didn't ask about their mom. After dinner, Marcy's father called, asking for help to post her bail. I declined politely, sensing he didn't fully understand, but was trying to be supportive. When I asked where Marcy would stay, he said she'd stay with them. So the boys and I packed her things into the truck and delivered them to her parents' house without issue. Back home, I noticed a U-Haul at Karen's house, which was gone the next morning. Marcy never called, and I relied on the newspaper for updates. I learned there was no trial. Marcy blamed Wally, and he claimed it was her idea. In the end, they both pled for leniency. Marcy got 3 to 5 years for conspiracy, and Wally got 5 to 10 for attempted liquidation. Federal agents looked into the silencer Wally used, but decided to wait on further action. Detective Green never mentioned the tape again. Karen vanished without a trace. My father chuckled when I returned his rifle, offering it again if needed. I served Marcy with divorce papers as soon as she started her sentence. She didn't contest it. Since that night, I hadn't seen or heard from her. I sold the house and moved back with my parents, who helped me take care of the boys since I couldn't manage work and parenting alone. My coworkers welcomed me back, even offering me a day shift, which I turned down. I took the boys monthly to see their mother at Muncie Women's Prison, waiting in the car while they visited. In good weather, they met outside where I could see them, but never asked or talked about it. This arrangement suited us all. Then I got a call. "Hello, is this Daniel Mercer?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is Daniel," I replied. "This is Angela Hawkins. Detective Darnell Green suggested I contact you. We need to talk." "Why do you want to speak with me?" I asked. "Tony DeMarco was my brother," she said. "Perfect. Just when I thought everything had settled, it all came rushing back." "I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't think I can help you," I said, hanging up before she could reply. 2 days later, she called back. "Daniel, could you meet me?" she asked. "Detective Green told me you're reasonable." "Where did you have in mind?" "I'd prefer a car dealership, but I'm flexible if there's somewhere more convenient for you." After a pause, I suggested, "Let's meet Saturday at 10 a.m. at the exhibition hall. I'll bring my sons. They enjoy looking at old cars." Not knowing her intentions, I felt safer meeting in public with the boys. I wasn't using them as shields, but I doubted she'd try anything with them around. She was Tony's sister, so I figured she'd be hot-blooded. Overthinking, I decided I needed a beer. I called Detective Green to ask what was going on. He laughed, telling me to relax and meet her. The Continental Classic was a large, impressive venue with an active opening celebration I hadn't anticipated. My boys were torn between admiring the cars and enjoying the free popcorn and sodas. Angela Hawkins was easy to spot. She approached with a steady walk, dark-haired, dark-eyed, and olive-skinned, with an unmistakably Italian look. At barely 5 feet, her build contrasted with her tall brothers. My curiosity stirred, but then I noticed her 10-year-old daughter, a miniature version of her mother. It was clear Angela was using her daughter for protection, just as I was using my sons. There we were, both relying on our children for a sense of safety. As she approached, she extended her hand with a friendly smile. "Daniel Mercer, I assume?" she asked. I shook her hand, finding it both polite and natural. "I've always wanted to say that, like in the movie about Dr. Livingston," she continued, her smile tinged with a hint of nervousness that oddly helped me relax. Before I could respond, she added, "This is my daughter, Carla." Todd smiled politely and introduced himself, while Terry extended his hand with a grin. "Carla, why don't you show the boys around while I talk to their dad?" she suggested. Carla took Terry into the showroom, and Todd headed straight for the hot dog stand, which I took as a good sign. Angela then offered, "We can talk here downstairs or upstairs in my office." "The office sounds fine," I replied. As we walked up to her office, I noticed several employees glancing our way, making comments and giving me thumbs-ups, which made me feel a bit self-conscious. Angela seemed to notice too, and she offered me a reassuring smile. "Did Detective Green fill you in on my situation?" she asked. I shook my head. "I won't bore you with my life story," she continued. "But Tony was my only family, and without a will, I inherited his business. The lawyer took a big cut, but I still ended up with more than I expected." Glad someone had gained something positive. I couldn't help noticing her wedding ring, her pierced ears, and a small silver cross around her neck. I tried to focus, but my eyes kept drifting. "Mr. Mercer, what are you looking at?" she asked, a playful smile on her face. Embarrassed, I replied, "I was admiring your crucifix, reminding myself to keep eye contact." She playfully tapped my hand. "How about a beer?" "That sounds like a good idea." Angela reached into a small fridge by the table, and as she bent over to grab some beers, I couldn't help but notice her figure. She handed me a beer, and we shared a moment of silence as we drank. "Well, Miss Hawkins," I said, breaking the quiet, "I'm glad things worked out for you, but I'm not sure why I'm here. I should get back to the boys." "Call me Angela. Can I call you Danny?" she replied. "Sure, but are we done here?" "No, just sit tight," she said, her expression turning serious. "Detective Green said you'd understand." I remained silent, hoping she would get to the point more quickly. Tony was a fool. A worthless idiot who deserved what he got. Strange as it sounds, I wanted to thank you. I froze, wondering if this was a setup. Was the room bugged, or was she wearing a mic? I found myself glancing at her neckline again. Are you recording this? I asked. No, why would I do that? I still wasn't fully convinced, but took another sip of my beer. Maybe I should go check on the boys, I suggested. Sit down, she replied firmly. Tony and I weren't close. 3 years ago, my husband died in an accident, and Tony was my only family. I asked him for help, but all he did was cover a few funeral costs and then ignore me. So his pass away worked out for you? I probed. Yes, maybe it's helped you too. We can just be grateful and leave it at that. Angela finished her beer and smiled faintly. Then suddenly she added, I need your help. You're the only one who can do it. What do you need? I asked. I want you to be the general manager here. You're crazy. I don't know anything about luxury cars. I already have people who handle that, she said. Then why me? Angela hesitated, looking around. Did you notice how my staff reacted when you walked in with me? Yeah, I saw, I replied. They didn't even smile. They think you liquidated Tony, and they're terrified of you, almost respectful. Do you get what I'm saying? They don't respect you? No, they're undermining me at every turn, and I can't stop it. So what could I do? Just be here. With time, we'll both learn enough to control things, but until then, I need you to keep them in line. I'm a decent guy, Angela. That's why Tony and my wife thought they could manipulate me. She relaxed a bit and smiled. Didn't turn out so well for them, did it? Oddly enough, I found myself laughing too. Over the next half hour, Angela and I discussed the terms. She was more than willing to offer a salary and benefits that surpassed what I had at the factory. If things didn't work out, I could always return, but going back wasn't what I wanted. I wanted things to improve. Todd didn't look so well when we got downstairs. He'd had too many hot dogs and sodas. Terry, on the other hand, was having a great time, chatting more with Carla than looking at the cars. This was definitely a good sign. Todd got sick in the truck on the way home and missed dinner. On Monday, I started my new job. Everything went as Angela had said it would. I was surprised by how quickly I adapted. I made friends with several employees and began learning the operations. Glenn, who had greeted me with a big smile on the first day, turned out to be my biggest supporter. Most employees wanted the business to succeed and were happy to work without fuss. Angela let me start firearm training for security, and I found I enjoyed it. I was living up to my reputation. Detective Green stopped by for coffee now and then, mostly for light, friendly chats. Eventually, he shared a bit more about himself. 3 years ago, I was a cop in Philadelphia, he said. One day, I came home to find my wife in bed with my boss. I knocked him up right then and there and kicked my wife out. The department gave me a choice, quit or be fired. Within a week, I had a job here. But before I left, I made sure that the guy who slept with my wife got fired too. I didn't ask for more details. It was his business. But I could see why he had my back. The boys agreed not to tell their mother about my new job. During visits, they occasionally commented on the long drive, but they seemed to understand it wasn't optional. I felt it was important for Marcy to see her sons, not for her sake, but as a reminder of what she lost. I know, it was cruel to use my kids this way, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction. Angela and I began spending more time together at work and outside of it. One weekend, the boys insisted we take her and Carla to Noble Grove. Most of the time, we stayed close to home. Living arrangements made a romantic relationship difficult. I was interested in Angela, but it felt awkward. I was still living at my parents' with the boys, and Angela and Carla shared a small one-room apartment. With things going better than expected, Angela started looking into buying a house. She spent a lot of time online searching for the perfect place. One day, she called to explain why she wanted a 4-bedroom home. Danny, I think it's important for each of the boys to have their own room. Better to handle this now than later. Don't you agree? Of course. I instantly recognized the question had more to it. It was clear Angela saw me as more than an employee. This romance had potential. Yes, that sounds good. And maybe a split-bedroom plan would be wise. I'd rather the kids weren't too close to the master bedroom. After saying that, I left the office and noticed her smiling. Our relationship was unusual. We hadn't been physically engaged, not even kissed, but I felt closer to her than I had with Marcy in 12 years. 2 days later, when my divorce from Marcy was finalized, we celebrated at Red Lobster. The kids didn't know the reason, but Angela did. Later, while the kids were watching pay-per-view, Angela pulled me aside in the kitchen, stood on her tiptoes, and kissed me. We were laughing and hugging when Carla walked in. Oops, sorry, Mom, she said, turning away. Guess it was about time. When we rejoined them, Carla whispered something to Terry, and they both smiled. Angela and I kept things reserved for the rest of the evening, but I looked forward to what was next. The following day, while the kids were at school, Angela and I took an extended lunch break and returned home, finally releasing all the pent-up energy. We got back to work just before closing. After that, long lunches became a regular thing, and Angela got serious about house hunting. Detective Green stopped by often, mostly to chat, though he occasionally glanced at the cars. He had developed a fondness for a Studebaker hawk once owned by Roger Ebert, and Angela had offered him a good deal on it. "Danny, I need you to take me to Marcy," she said one day. Her request surprised me. The boys and I had been visiting Marcy less frequently, but she never seemed to mind. "Is there a reason?" I asked. "Unfinished business. I need to wrap it up," she replied. I still didn't fully understand what she meant. I grasped her words, but struggled to comprehend the underlying idea. "Do you want me to go in with you?" I offered. "Just drive me. You don't need to stay with me during the talk," she said. It was a warm, sunny fall day when we arrived in Muncie. The prisoner meetings were held outside, so I parked near the fence. 10 minutes later, Marcy and Angela came out to the courtyard and sat at a table. They started talking and smiling, almost like old friends. But after 5 minutes, the mood shifted. Marcy's smile vanished. She stood up, leaning over the table, glaring at Angela, who still looked completely calm. Suddenly, Marcy lunged across the table, trying to grab Angela. Security quickly intervened, pulling Marcy back into the building as she kicked and yelled. Angela turned to glance at me, smiled, and shrugged before leaving the visitor area. She was still smiling as she got back in the car. "What on earth was that all about?" I asked, bewildered. "Your ex-wife is quite the piece of work," Angela laughed. We drove a few miles and she adjusted her seatbelt. I introduced myself, and at first she seemed glad to see me. Everything was fine as long as she thought I was on her side. I admit, I misled her a bit at first. "What did you say?" I inquired. I told her I came from Baltimore to get revenge. "She probably assumed you meant revenge against me," I guessed. "Exactly. I actually meant I was going to get even with Tony by taking over his business. I guess you can get revenge on a dead guy, right?" "Sure, but what made her so mad?" Angela asked. She started pressing for specifics like when and how. Obviously, she thought I was talking about you. Now I was curious. "So, what did you tell her?" I told her it would take a long, long time and asked if she wanted updates. She eagerly agreed, wanting every detail. But when I explained my plan, she lost it, just went wild. I laughed. "That's priceless. All right, so what's this plan to liquidate me? I'm all ears." Angela's smile widened. I told her I'd do it by having sex with you until you drop dead. "And that's it?" I asked, surprised. "Yep, funny, right?" I thought she'd get angry, but I didn't expect her to completely lose it. We sat in silence for a moment, both smiling. I couldn't have been prouder. "So when's this attack supposed to start?" I asked, grinning. "As soon as we get to the next motel, silly." 2 months later, Angela and I got married in a small backyard ceremony at our new home. Angela even sent Marcy an invitation with a little note inside. "Everything's going according to plan. He should be dead in 40 to 50 years."